Welcome everyone, my name is Ellen Yeong, and you're currently watching a recorded Zoom artist interview with Troc Art Space. Wherever you are, thank you for joining us. I would like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're all currently located. Troc Art Space acknowledges that we're on the traditional lands of Boon Wurrung and Wurundjeri peoples, and we pay our respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and through them to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Today, Lucy Kingsley has generously joined us for her artist interview with Troc Art Space. She is an emerging Narrm Melbourne-based visual artist and physical theatre performer. Her work is curious towards corporeality, which does not have a body. She will be having her upcoming exhibition, Rapunzel, Let Down Your Severed Hair, at Troc Art Space later this year. Wherever you are, please welcome Lucy Kingsley. Hi, Lucy. How are you today?
Hi, Ellen. Good, thanks, Ellen. How are you?
Good. So, for those who are not familiar with you, could you please kindly introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So as you said, I'm an emerging Melbourne-based visual artist. My practice is supported by an exploration into mostly collage, also delving into painting, drawing, video, sculpture, and creative writing. I use the word collage to describe my work in the sense of looking at, like, I often work to bring a lot of different source materials together, so a lot of visual data, and then layer them over video and also in a paper form. So it's kind of essential to the methodology of my working, and then also results in a collage looking form. My work is usually looking at the experience of the body and a lot of kind of subjective experiences of the world. My most recent exhibition, which was my first solo, was at Rubicon Art Space in North Melbourne. And that was a great experience as my first solo exhibition. And it was kind of re-exhibiting some honours work from a few years ago that was looking at the idea of, it was a body of work curious toward the idea of the physical wound as a kind of physical site, but also a more philosophical site looking at the idea of trauma. And that work kind of inquired into a different set of narratives around contact and boundaries, ideas of horror and violence, the ritualistic and ceremonial, and ideas of health and unhealth. So that exhibition was called A New Space Made Possible by Loss. And I'm kind of just beginning to become kind of more public as an artist. So that's why I very much use the term like emerging artist. Still kind of getting a sense of what my work kind of probes at what the subject of it is. So really looking forward to when the exhibition at Troc Art can come about in a physical sense. So it's really great to have these virtual explorations of the exhibition that is still to happen. What else? I undertook a interesting residency program it was a 2-month program between July and September last year in a tiny village in Italy.
Wow.
It was down south in southern Italy, so not the side of Naples, but the other side. You could actually see the Greek islands from the coastal town I was at, and it was a small town called Galiano del Capo. Only has about 4,000 people, who live there residentially. And yeah, I was applied to just do some work at a really small contemporary arts organisation down there. So I was the only artist in resident, and there were a couple of other volunteers and other staff members kind of working projects, building exhibitions, and a lot of kind of projects they were doing was looking at the idea of extreme land and remote land, because the site of the village is such an extreme location. It's kind of on it only the village only really hosts like a small portion of like tourism running through there, and they're mostly European tourists. And it was kind of very strange for me to be like this lone female artist from Australia there, and I don't speak Italian and could only really converse with 4 or 5 other people for that whole 2-month period. So yeah, it was really interesting, and it was personally and professionally like a really kind of transformative time for me. And I really kind of undertook it as an experiment in kind of deciding whether I wanted to continue an art practice, and kind of putting myself in quite an extreme scenario that in a lot of ways kind of I'm revisiting right now. And I guess a lot of us are managing these ideas of like limitation in movement and restriction of our lifestyle, and that was very much what I was going through there. Socially I couldn't really converse that often, and kind of it's interesting comparing like the isolation of being in Italy and kind of investigating my art practice again with the current situation globally that we're all facing now, of these very unusual circumstances that limit what we would usually be doing. So yeah, that was a really great thing to go through last year.
Right. Well, I'm also interested, like in your practice, you said you're interested in themes that are common in fairy tales and folk tales. How did you come to explore these themes, and could you please explain some of your favorite themes that you have explored the most?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about European kind of Grimm Brothers kind of staple fairy tales and folk tales, like Cinderella and Rapunzel and all these things that kind of maybe at their time of popularization kind of aim to be like a moral code for societies in Europe. And I think they, continue to hold a really powerful space in like the cultural imagination of kind of Western ideas of how we're all meant to live our lives. And they always seem to hold, I'm kind of drawn to them because they have these really kind of graphic connotations to them, like the way they look at metamorphosis and flesh and violence and health and animals and fur and sacrifice and ideas of transition from times of day. There's like these really strong motifs that always repeat. And I think when I was doing that residency last year in Italy, it was such a kind of fantastical, like dreamlike experience. And I was actually writing a lot about my experiences kind of in like a poetry prose form. And I noticed that I was kind of referencing motifs from these stories, or like using structures that they would use, like doing lots of I might actually like read a little bit of a
Sure.
is that okay? Like I might read a little bit of a piece that I wrote called Rapunzel, Rapunzel, Let Down Your Severed Hair, which is the title of the Trocadero exhibition that I will be exhibiting. So yeah, this piece kind of looks at kind of elements of what I was experiencing over there. So I'll just read it and then come back to the idea of fairy tales and folk tales. So this is an excerpt from it, and it's: a few days ago, I sizzled my fringe on a stovetop I was invited to smoke from. With a carina in hand, left alone whilst the stranger finished an errand, I noticed his bed sheets were on the couch instead of the bed, and we laughed about the library I was trying to find. That was not open because it did not exist. He swiped away the dead strings from my forehead. They began to fly with the wind, and I thought it was tobacco. You are not naturally golden, he asks as I tip upside down and comb from my roots. I fan spaghetti into salted water so the straws meet the heat and sink evenly into the boil. Then extract a blonde thread and throw it against the wall. It sticks. It's ready. So yeah, it was kind of, I guess that's kind of like a form of storytelling, and kind of looking at ideas of the way material undergoes a transformation, looking at, there's a lot of kind of repetition of the motif of hair and the way that's referred to as spaghetti. And there's kind of like a mixing of something quite violent happening that is, to me, has a lot of associations with like European mythology. Yeah, and someone I'm quite influenced by is an American female writer. She was mostly prominent in the 70s, writing these like mostly brilliant short stories, looking at traditional European folk tales like Snow White and Red Riding Hood. Her name's Angela Carter. And she was kind of inspired by 19th century symbolist poets and also 20th century French surrealist writers. And her stories always have like a kind of feminist perspective and really subvert the really problematic aspects of those folk tales in a really interesting way. And so I read a lot of her stuff and kind of draw from the visuals that she references. Yeah.
So just going back to your experience at the residency program in Italy, you said there weren't many people around. Has that kind of isolating experience influenced you in some way working with European mythology and motifs that surround fairy tales?
Yeah, because the time I spent there was, as you say, so isolating. Everything did kind of start to become a bit otherworldly and feeling like I was existing in a bit of a fictional space. And I think it was consequently very, like, just happened quite naturally for me to begin to think about folk tales and narratives that are similarly engaged with ideas of isolation. So this idea that, like, you know, Rapunzel is a lone figure in a tower, kind of waiting for things to happen. You know, I didn't, you know, in my experience there, it's not like I was trying to conflate our two identities or anything, but there were kind of qualities of my experience there that made sense for me to kind of record and think about as a mythological happening. So, like, for example, just thinking like visually and spatially, I worked and also lived in the one space where the contemporary art organisation was running from, which ran on top of a train station, and I kept thinking about this idea of height because we kind of lived on the second floor of this station that I would go up to the rooftop every so often and kind of have a really, good view of like the flat landscape around me, and everything was so sparse that it kind of was interesting for me to think about how my days were also quite sparse and like not a lot was kind of happening, and also the time and the pace of things was so slow. It kind of felt like everyone moved in slow motion, and it was a place that, socially and politically is quite isolated from the rest of the world, because the only outsiders that would come in, very divorced from the happenings there, and like a stranger coming in, like a foreigner coming in. The only people who would be doing that would be kind of wealthy European tourists who would stay at this really kind of mythological looking palazzo, like a palace in the middle of the town centre on the piazza. And so there was basically me, this kind of, very out of place Australian young lone woman, being an artist there, and then the occasional tourist passing through, and it was kind of a transitory space in that way. So a lot of what was happening, or my perception of what was happening there as an outsider there, made a lot of sense with thinking about European mythology and folk tales and things. And just to close off that idea of height, not only was I kind of always positioned and looking at things from that high standpoint, the village itself existed on a cliff face. And so a lot of the reasons people go there, and also why there was a contemporary arts organisation running out of there, was because it's such an extreme land, it's an extreme territory. So these grottos and these cliff faces kind of demarcate the end of Europe and the beginnings of the seas and waters that would lead to the Greek islands and the north of Africa. And so geographically it was an isolated place, and you'd have to, I used to ride this bike around on the roads there, and the road would run on the periphery of the coast, and every time you wanted to go down to the beaches that would be kind of dotted along the coast in between villages, you'd have to do a massive drop and kind of dive down quite dramatically on like a steep hill to get to the beaches, which I guess is a lot like often the way that, land and water kind of meet each other. But it was such a significant drop that, I couldn't really escape this idea of descending and ascending and coming back up and down. So I think that's also part of the reason I was thinking about ideas of like towers and Rapunzel and things.
In your practice, you often involve images in mosaic and storyboard formats. And how do you choose which images to include in these formats, and why do you use these formats to explore the themes that you just talked about?
Yeah, so the way I often work is by revisiting this library of images that I've been collecting over time. So I often will kind of develop that portfolio of visuals by working on my laptop, like screenshotting images or like stills from films, and then uploading photographs I take on my camera and my phone onto the computer to be added to the archive. And I guess what I often try to do is kind of map or diagram the visual repetitions and all of those visuals. So I often kind of line them up one next to each other, or I start by kind of bringing together two images side by side, and looking at the way that now unified image can be viewed from left to right. So yeah, because my work is often operating in a way where it brings visuals together to tell a collective narrative that is kind of narrative, not in the sense of like a linear progression narrative, but just maybe even a fragmented or fractured narrative. I'm often playing with those tropes of like the Western way you read a text or a sentence, for example, by reading left to right. And I guess when I'm working with mosaic, kind of bringing together of imagery where it may appear more as a grid than like a succession of lined images, more like a photo collage strip, the mosaic kind of experiments with what does it mean for multiple images to kind of occupy the same real estate in the one view. And then, yeah, with video, in terms of working with video and this idea of formatting, yeah, I find it interesting how images can layer on top of one another, and what does it mean for one image to appear one after the other and kind of accumulate into an eventual story where you're really only viewing one image at a time, but all of these things are kind of gaining momentum to tell something overall. Yeah, and with these formats, yeah, I like to think about those collage strips in terms of being film storyboards, or, you know, old 35mm like film strips. Yeah, so I guess all of that work is kind of probing at the idea of how the presentation of images kind of leads the viewer to encounter them in a deliberate way where things are kind of progressing to tell something in the end. Yeah. And yeah, recently I think all of this is linked into the idea of time, and I really want to kind of abolish all understanding of how I think and perceive of time at the moment being like a linear progression of like the past is behind you and the future is in front of you and everything's kind of flowing on. I think that kind of the way we're conditioned in this kind of capitalist way of thinking to perceive time is really narrow and limiting, and doesn't really serve me personally and also artistically. And I think my work is looking at time as well and how that is spatialized and visualized. And when I do a lot of creative writing, as I mentioned before, that kind of goes hand in hand with this kind of image building and image collecting. And in the slideshow here, I've just put up a text, kind of like a visual poem named Up, Down, Up, Down. And this poem talks about, or was written on a day when I was at the residency in Italy, when I rode my bike along those cliff faces, and the landscape was so hilly, and I would kind of have to go up and down on the bike, and I eventually arrived at another town where there was a church, and I kind of, in the poem, it often references these two different time spaces of kind of experiencing that bike journey as of something that happened in the past, whilst kind of explaining it in the present.
I did a vertical strip of, one sentence, and then put some text that references the past on the left-hand side and then the present on the right-hand side, which kind of references the way that that church I ended up in is kind of set up in the interior of being like having the central nave and then the, two sets of pews symmetrically balanced either side of it. And on the right-hand side of this slideshow, there's just a still of a video experiment I did recently of maybe being a visual that could be included in the eventual work of, the up down poetry. Like I was thinking maybe I could record me presenting or delivering that text over the top of this kind of single frame video of me riding the bike. And the way I set up that frame was very much in direct relation to how I wrote the text, of having that kind of central vertical spine going up the middle. So my body is kind of, positioned in the middle of that frame, and as is the bike, and it kind of, in a way, illustrates some of the visual components of the text on the left-hand side. So I guess overall, my work kind of comes about in this space, in this thinking space between text and visual, and the way I experiment with mosaic and storyboard formats is kind of an extension of that realm of thinking where an episode or a narrative happening across time is being delivered and spatialized in different ways. Yeah.
It's just interesting looking at the text. There's like an order of past and present, and the way how I register it first is, instead of as a text, I register it as an image. It's very symmetrical, ordered image, and took me a bit of time to get into reading individual words. Is there some kind of a reason why you've, aside from like following that structure of having the spine and referring to the image on the right, is there a why you're drawn into putting the order of words and paragraphs and sentences in more like a very symmetrical kind of form?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure why I did that beyond what I already mentioned about the poem being about eventually arriving at that church space, and the interior architecture of churches being, very beautiful spaces that are kind of always aesthetically have that balance and that symmetry, and it's something that I can't seem to really escape with my work of coming back to long, kind of rectangular, vertical or horizontal forms, which you might be able to get a sense of in some of the images in the slideshow. Like, I often think about, how the body shifts often between these two positions of being like an upright, standing vertical figure that's like quite active and mobile, and then, when we sleep or when we die, we become a corpse and we kind of become a horizontal, long form that is in a way a very vulnerable position, because you're not that upright figure anymore, able to kind of, manage threat or anything. So the idea of vertical and horizontal and seems to be a recurrent visual in my work. Yeah.
And talking about your upcoming exhibition with the themes, what are the themes that you will explore in your upcoming exhibition, Rapunzel, Rapunzel Let Down Your Disappeared Hair at Troc Art Space. And have there been any texts or occasions that inspired you to explore these themes?
Yeah, the exhibition at Troco will mostly feature a video collage, which is likely to be presented in a projection on the wall in Gallery 2. And the work splices two kind of worlds of visuals. So the first world is footage of young adolescent boys jumping from the cliff faces into the water at the village at the residency I was at in Italy last year. So it kind of has that visual going, which is like a pretty common thing that people do in Italy as, you know, residents or holidayers, you know, as a fun thing to jump off the cliffs. So I recorded a lot of that. And the second world that the visuals draw on is direct extracts from this film from 1976, which is actually a pornographic film named Alice in Wonderland, an X-rated musical comedy. So the work is quite bizarre and absurd in the way it kind of splices these two happenings together. And the Alice in Wonderland film itself, as you may be able to tell, is kind of looking at the Lewis Carroll novels of Alice in Wonderland and using that narrative to become a pornographic film that is based around how Alice as a young woman kind of comes into her sexuality. But the way that my video works, I suppose, is it tries to kind of probe at the idea of the sublime, and that being an experience where it's a kind of an extreme state where things kind of become incomprehensible, and the sublime is often thought about in terms of a divine experience. And I'm reading this text at the moment by the French intellectual, mostly writing in the 40s. His name's Georges Bataille, and the text is called Eroticism, Death and Sensuality. And it's a really dense philosophical text that looks at the similarities between sex and death, which is kind of a very historically established psychoanalytical idea. You know, we all know that phrase of like an orgasm being a little death. And in this text, Bataille looks at all kinds of things like erotic experience and sacrifice and transgression and taboo. And there's this kind of returned idea that he comes back to and introduces at the beginning of the book of life being like, as beings, we're kind of in this crisis of being separate and attached to everything around us. And he talks about life as a constant mourning of our creation. So he plays with this, or he interrogates this idea of continuity and discontinuity. And just to explain, I know it's a bit dense and deep, but just to explain briefly, like if you think about you know, our entrance into the world being, you know, a fetus growing in the body of another, in the mother's body, and then going through a very kind of violent and traumatic entrance into the world of separating from that body and being and becoming a form of our own. That is
that is the origin of our being, which is the transition between continuously attached to another kind of physically and then becoming a separate, discontinuous being in our own right. And throughout the book, Bataille looks at the way that erotic experience, mostly in the realm of sex, but I think eroticism can be more broadly thought of as kind of a return to a vitality of living. And he talks about how what it means to have an erotic experience and what it taught and how that has a relationship to death, and this idea of continuity and discontinuity. And he talks about violence as this force or this episode or this kind of physical thing that is capable of bringing about that transition from continuity to discontinuity. So like violence implies the idea of threat, which, you know, may eventuate in death. And in death, we, similar to when we were born, we no longer are discontinuous, we're continuous in that we return to whatever is after, which is like no longer living. So I'm not sure if that makes sense, but I think that I've been reading this as I've been making this video collage, and the collage kind of really comes together at this moment when one of the boys is jumping into the water and crashes through the surface, almost like smacks into the water's surface into a new world of being below water. And that very like loud, very quick instant is repeated with alongside another visual of the pornographic film when Alice kind of flips her hair down and kind of begins this idea of coming into beginning her journey into Wonderland, which is like a sexually adventurous realm for her, or that's the way it's framed in the film. And so the video collage for a long time percussively revisits this moment of this boy smacking into the water and Alice flipping her hair down and releasing her hair from her ponytail. And so it kind of frames these two very physical moments, and that's when the collage, I think, really begins to address this idea of violence and the sublime. Yeah.
I can see that you continuously work with the violence element of whether it's in the text itself or in the image or in the essays or writings that you're reading from, or the just general violence in that underlies in the motive of fairy tale and European mythology. Is there a reason why you're drawn into that, or were you not aware that you were going back to work with the idea of violence and somehow the concept that violence is present in your work?
Yeah, I think the work that I presented at Rubicon in January this year was a really formative. The body of work presented was a really formative collection of works that revealed to me a lot about what the subject of my work might be. And the way I framed the theoretical investigation of that work was looking at the idea of a physical flesh wound,
trauma and the theoretical idea of trauma. And because my work is very much kind of pivoting around this idea of what it means to be a body and what corporality, you know, reveals to us about what it means to be, you know, living beings. I think like violence has kind of, yeah, always been like a common thread from that point, from that body of work. And yeah, I think it continues to come up with this idea of skin being a physical surface that produces a dichotomy between, you know, what is self and what is other. It's like a clear barrier that demarcates, you know, the beginning and the beginning of the self and the end of the self and the beginning of the other. Is, you know, it's a surface that kind of is philosophically like a really rich thing to think about and to ponder on. But it's also like, you know, something that's able to be, you know, non-cognitively understood as something that can be put under threat. And yeah, looking at the way that work was looking at the idea of the wound being you know, the wound as like a hole in the skin almost. It kind of gets back to this idea of what I'm looking at this in this current video work of what it means to disrupt a kind of continuous experience or a continuous surface. Yeah, so violence is interesting to me in the idea of boundary crossing. I think that's the best way to describe it. And all those you know, Grimm Brothers, European mythological tales are extremely problematic in, you know, the way that violence against women is kind of just, you know, naively talked about and not even interrogated in any way. And yeah, my work kind of revisits those tales, not in, you know, not in the interest of highlighting those the horror of those things, but I think there's something to be said about people's interest in what violence is and what horror is and what space that occupies in people's psychology and cultural imagination.
You also said you're interested in working with painting and drawing along with the video and images in the exhibition. How are they different or similar to the way you work with the digital images and video works?
Yeah, drawing, I feel like drawing is a kind of staple of making for a lot of artists, and I know that it is for me. It's kind of I've always thought of drawing as like a really great kind of example of or a really interesting metaphor for what art making is in general, which is kind of a, you know, if you think of representational drawing as a recording of one's perspective, and so when you know, go to draw something, you're kind of suspending all assumptions about what is in front of you to objectively note down and draw what that is, which is, you know, like a collection of lines and shapes. So I think drawing like occupies like an interesting space in like my studio work, and the way it often comes about is that when I look at all the photographs I collect in my archive, I'll put them side by side and do
like a drawn diagram of what the visual relationships are between those two images, as a way of interrogating like the points of relationship between those images that might just be, you know, visual similarities, but it might also reveal something more conceptual that kind of bringing together of images is looking at. And so that's the way drawing kind of appears in my work most often. But then the other thing is that when I do make written pieces, so in my creative writing, it doesn't really kind of, like, I wouldn't say, you know, I'm a poet and I write a text that is in the form of, or uses the conventions of poetry to be a text in and of itself. It's more a research method I do and something I use to eventually arrive at a visual. So when I do a poem, I'll firstly look at the graphic or the visual imagery that runs in the content of the poem, but what I'll do is I'll do diagrams on the side and kind of annotate the writing with drawings, and then the diagrams will often almost become like scores or like launch pads for taking action to do something else, like make a sculpture. And that's the way that the work came about, which is in that slideshow there. And you can see on the right hand side some sketches I did before making that work, of the idea of two kind of heavy materials being stacked on top of one another and then laid out again. So that action that the drawing implied was a jumping off point to make a sculpture, which eventually became a video work. So I think that drawing and creative writing are kind of the foundation, or like often the point of departure for like other modes of making that eventually lead to video and digital works. Yeah.
Since you're collaging different images and writing texts and putting that into different forms, whether if it's symmetrical or in different formats, do you somehow see yourself as a writer, creative writer, in a sense that who writes their own type of mythology?
Oh, that's such a good question. Yeah, I think so. I think that's right. Like, I think making, you know, any kind of creation and making is a form of world making. So I'd like to think that my work is kind of slowly revealing of some kind of overall narrative or subject of work that I'm not quite sure what that is yet. So there is kind of a mystery about why we make, and I kind of like to think about art making as an act of faith. Like, you're never really certain if what you're going to do is going to be worthy, and so you kind of have an idea and you put aside your ego to pursue an idea that you believe will reveal something back to you. And I like to think of art making not as like a like a creation of something, but more a purging of all of this visual material that needs to like leave my system, so that it can just exist and I can kind of move on. And so I think there's something about like where art comes from, that it doesn't really know its source, and it's kind of mythological in that way, and it's what that source is kind of sacred, and it can't really be revealed or made visible, but we can make, you know, visual artworks that provide insight about what that source is.
Mm. Mm. How has your art practice in general evolved during the COVID-19 situation? And will this time in isolation spark new threads to explore within your art practice?
Yeah, I think this is a really strange time and is so unusual, and, you know, even all these months in, it's still kind of incomprehensible in a way, and artistic, I don't know, it's hard, isn't it? Because, you know, so many things have been made still or something, but a lot of other things you can't really ignore what was happening beforehand. And, you know, some people's art practices, you know, will continue to be explored, and they'll work throughout this period, despite, you know, the conditions and the COVID-19 situation. And I think I would be one of those people who isn't really conceptually going to engage with the situation, but I think the conditions of what we're facing may kind of influence the work, or like the way I practice. I think that's what may happen. But it is such a strange thing that is, you know, I don't really like this term return, like, when will things be back to normal, or when will they return to normal, because things have changed, and there's kind of a lot of positive things that are being revealed about this situation, about like how we live that's actually not that healthy, or, you know, privileges certain people above others. So I think there's a lot of reasons artistically for being really present with whatever this situation does to the self, and to kind of pay a lot of attention to what you're going through as an individual and what that means, but also like what society is going through, and the way others are kind of coming to realizations about the way they live. Yeah.
I think it's a really tough time of the year, and we don't know if this will be a temporary or will be with us for a longer period of time. I hope that there will be a positive impact later on when we do come out from isolation, even if social distancing is still in place. And yeah, thank you, Lucy. It has been lovely to speak with you about your practice and your upcoming exhibition at Troc Art Space. And thank you to all of you watching this recorded Zoom artist interview with Lucy Kingsley.
Thanks, Ellen. It's been yeah, really cool to chat, and I really appreciate your interest in my work, and it's really nice to have this opportunity to reflect on my practice during this time. So yeah, I really appreciate your time.
Thank you.